Okay, so last week we talked about life in the 1920s, 100 years ago. Today we're going to continue that. There's two readings. We had a good reading last week and then a reading this week. Um, I think it's really interesting. Like the early 1900s, like we said last week, we see a lot of, and let's say the 1920s, we see a lot of modern things start to happen. Now, of course, things have obviously continued to change, and maybe we can say are changing even faster than they changed back then. But it was some pretty rapid change. Um, I guess going back a few weeks when we talked about the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, I think I'm always impressed with how much life would have changed after the Civil War, right? The end of, especially if you were an enslaved African American, suddenly the 13th Amendment happens, the Civil War ends, the 13th Amendment happens, you're free. Then the 14th Amendment, men only, African American men become not slaves, become citizens. And then the 15th Amendment, all within a span of like 5 years, you go from slave to free to citizen to voting with the 15th Amendment. That's some pretty rapid change. And of course, we talked about the Reconstruction and how some really good things happened, and then the what was it, the Compromise of 1877 kind of brought an end to a lot of those good things. But history is a story of change, right? There's no denying. If you look back 100 years ago, 1920s, if you look back 500 years ago to the medieval periods, right? Christopher Columbus sailing across the ocean. Go 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago to Bible times, beyond that. Obviously, things have changed, but I think it's fun to see that change. But I think when we turn to modern history, say 1920s, a little bit modern, you see the change. There's no denying that change, but you can also see similarities between yourself and those people and your world and their world. And I think it's fun to see both the change and the similarities.
Hmm.
Um, And as I think I said last week, it's always interesting. I view myself in that time. How would I have lived? What would it have been like? What decision would I have made if I was in this person's shoes,
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's always interesting to look at that kind of stuff. And when you talk about the 1920s, like we said last week, um, there's some real similarities. We talked about consumption, right? Credit, not credit cards, but buying something on credit, right? Taking out a loan of sorts to buy consumer goods, as we talked about. That's it's not a physical invention you can hold, but it's an invention that really makes it possible for people to buy more stuff. Um, there's just more stuff then, a lot of inventions are happening. Looked at automobiles, Henry Ford's Model T, which of course they make on an assembly line, so that makes it cheaper, more people can buy it. Airplanes. You have the Wright brothers in 1903, and then by 1927, Charles Lindbergh is the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Big deal, very big deal at the time. Um, and then that also kind of, this only hints at it a little bit. Charles Lindbergh, like
Hello,
we
hello.
talked. Hey, Jendaya and
Hey, I'm
Elena.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm late. I'm sorry. I'm late.
Oh, you're good. And Elena, Rana, thank you for logging in there.
Sorry, I'm late. Sorry,
And
Um,
I'm late.
And I think I said last week, Charles Lindbergh was really like the one of the first
You got it.
worldwide, world famous celebrities. He really something about flying across the Atlantic solo in an
oh,
airplane
that's
really just drives the world crazy. They want to see him. So in a way, you could do all kinds of studies on popularity, celebrity, the history of celebrity. Um, but Charles Lindbergh was famous around the world and certainly across the United States. So we have automobiles, airplane technology, other technology, increased access to electricity, right?
mhm.
More more. more homes and businesses, and more homes across the country are getting electricity, which think up until 100 years ago, it wasn't guaranteed that you would build a house and it would have electricity. But when more people have electricity, maybe it's more inexpensive, it's more available, not just in cities, but outside cities and in the country. You get things like radios, phonographs, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators. We talked about how a lot of it was aimed at women, supposedly making their lives easier, right? But just because you save time doing one thing doesn't mean you're going to sit around and read a book the rest of the day. There's in this world, even today, whenever we free up an hour because one thing gets easier, we're expected to fill that hour with doing something else, right? So today we're going to pick up, keep our focus on the 1920s, keep our focus on what was life like for regular people. And so we have movies, radio, and sports in the 1920s. Okay. So it says there's two main points. It says for many middle class Americans, the 1920s was a decade of unprecedented prosperity. Rising earnings generated more disposable income for the consumption of entertainment and leisure. We talked about disposable income, right? Just free income after you pay your bills, you pay your rent, your mortgage, whatever. Disposable income. Rising earnings, which, we could talk all about the economy in the 1920s. But the average person, middle class family, was doing well. The economy was doing well. Of course, this is right before the 1929 stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. But things were going well. The average middle class family was doing well. So they have disposable income to buy stuff and to spend on entertainment and leisure. It says this new wealth coincided with and fueled technological innovations, resulting in the booming popularity of entertainments like movies, sports, and radio programs. Okay, so let's jump in. Again, we're going to see differences, but I think we're also going to see similarities. Not necessarily, we're not gathering, our families aren't gathering around the radio tonight and listening to a radio show, but you can see different versions, right? Different parallel versions of our modern society. We don't sit around, we don't even, a lot of people don't even sit around and watch cable television anymore, right? Tune in, what's on at 8 o'clock, what's on at 9 o'clock. A lot of people don't watch TV like that anymore either, right? We've moved on to the next thing, which is streaming. You can watch anything you want at any time. You pick when you push play, right? With Netflix and Hulu and everything, and just YouTube even. So we're a couple of steps removed from the 1920s, but you can still see similarities. So let's think about the GED test. A lot of times those questions are going to ask you to make historical connections, similarities, or differences, right? You don't have to write an essay. It's just multiple choice, but that multiple choice is sometimes going to ask you for historical skills, and one historical skill is seeing similarities and differences between two things they give you. Okay, so let's jump in. Oluwakemi, can you read paragraph 1?
Okay. Leisure and consumption in the 1920s. The increased financial prosperity of the 1920s gave many Americans more disposable income to spend on entertaining themselves. This influx of cash, coupled with advancements in technology, led to new patterns of leisure, time spent having fun, and consumption, buying products. In this period, movies and sports became increasingly popular, while commercial radio and magazines turned athletes and actors into national icons.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's really just a kind of an introduction here. But so we're not getting any real facts here. But it says, advanced influx of cash, people have more money, like we just said, coupled with advancements in technology, led to new patterns of leisure and consumption. Okay. Now, a couple of good academic words here. We know leisure, consumption when you're talking about economics in this, like say in the social studies GED test. Consumption just means buying stuff, right? We talked about last week, not necessarily consuming like you consume food, but just consuming goods, you're buying stuff. And it talks about commercial radio and magazines. What does that mean, commercial radio? Or if we talk about commercial television?
In the radio, they put the commercial advertise.
Right. Okay. So commercial advertisements, right? A commercial is a noun. A commercial is, we know what a commercial is.
Right.
But if, okay, so if I own a commercial radio station, how do I make my money?
You try to introduce the product you selling, and then try to convince people to buy it.
Yeah. Okay. So, but if I'm the owner of the radio station, right? To have it costs money to buy a radio, but the beauty of a radio at the time was it was free. Once you bought it, getting the signal is free, right?
Oh, really?
So, I mean, there's today, you have to pay for cable, but back then, just the radio signal is just, whatever it is, I don't know, radio waves in the air, right?
Right.
So it costs money to buy a radio. You go
Okay.
to the store, you buy a big radio, and I think I put a picture somewhere. Oh, I think I put it down below. Here's some, yeah. Or even last week, I think I Googled 1920s radio. So it costs money to buy a radio, right? But then once you have it, it's free.
Okay.
Right? There's no radio company that you pay a bill to, right? So for me, if I'm going to run a radio station and I have programming, I have shows, I pay for that radio station by selling ads, right? A car company or a toothpaste company pays me to run their ad on the radio. Then people sitting at home listening to the radio hear their ads, and of course they hope that they go buy it, right? But so when it talks about commercial, it's talking about commercial radio means it's usually that thing is free to you, the consumer sitting at home listening to your radio, but it's paid for by selling commercial advertisements. Okay. So commercial radio, commercial magazines. A commercial magazine means, yeah, probably you have to pay, you have to buy the magazine. The consumer has to buy the magazine. But it's also paid for quite a bit by companies paying to put their ads, their advertisements in the magazines. Okay, so that's commercial radio, commercial magazines. Cinema in the 1920s. It says, as the popularity of moving pictures grew in the early part of the decade, movie palaces capable of seating thousands sprang up in major cities. A ticket for a double feature and a live show cost 25 cents. So a double feature would mean you pay 25 cents, you go see two movies and a live show, some sort of live performer, right? So for 25 cents, you could spend the whole day at the movie theater, basically. I listened to a history book on audiobook one time. It was really interesting. And like going to the movies was a very big deal, and B, very affordable. And a lot of like mothers would just give their kids 25 cents and say, here, go to the movies. And they'd just spend the whole day at the movies. And then mom would be at home, if she was a stay-at-home mom or whatever. Like a lot of parents just sent their kids to the movies all day just to get them out of the house. So it says, for a quarter, Americans could escape from their problems and lose themselves in another era or world. People of all ages attended the movies with far more regularity than today, often going more than once per week. Okay, so it's very popular. By the end of the decade, weekly movie attendance swelled to 90 million people. I don't even know what the population would be by the end of the decade, but today we're 330 million people. So back then it's probably half that. So I would say most people went to the movies every week. You know,
Hmm.
I'm not positive about that, but I'm pretty confident in saying that that's probably true. Most Americans went to the movies most weeks. Um, they don't have TV at home. There is radio. We're going to talk about radio in a minute. But if you want to see one of these new, you know, it says moving pictures, right? Because movies, film is a new thing at this time. And it started just, I think, in the late 1800s. So by 1920s, it's still a fairly new thing, black and white, silent movies mostly throughout the 1920s. But, you know, if you want to go see a moving picture, you can't do it on a television. There is no television. You go and you watch, and that's where people would watch. They'd show a little bit of the news, um, you know, and it says for a ticket for a
Mhm.
double feature and a live show costs 25 cents. So a lot of people, it was pretty affordable and it was pretty great. Also, movie theaters, these giant movie palaces, they called, capable of seating thousands, were the first places in cities to get air conditioning.
Hmm.
Okay, when they were inventing the basics of air conditioning around this time, uh, people didn't have it in their homes. It was too expensive. Most businesses wouldn't have it. It was too expensive. But movie theaters said, hey, if we offer air conditioning uh, or cooled air, as they called it, you know, a hot summer, big theater could get really hot if it's a sunny day, you know.
Mhm.
So they say, well, we're gonna pay a lot of money and get this air conditioning system installed, and more people will come to the movies. So you know, it's a reason to the reason for doing it was to make money.
Mhm.
So these big movie theaters were the first public places that you could experience air conditioning. So more people went. This, you know, it's in hot cities, hot summers, people went to the movies. Very popular. Um, Elena, could you read paragraph 3, please?
Okay. The silence movie. The silence movies of the early 1920s give rise to the first generation of movie stars. No star uh, captured the attention of the American viewing public more than Charlie Chaplin, sad-eyed with a mustache, baggy pants, and cane. Chaplin was the top box office attraction of his time.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, and I put a picture of him. This is from a movie called The Tramp. And I've never seen the movie, but I think it came out The Tramp came out in the 1920s. This is Charlie Chaplin, and in the movie, he was one of the other characters was this little poor boy. Let me see if I can find. There's a famous clip of Charlie Chaplin. Has anybody ever seen Charlie Chaplin before?
I saw on TV
Actual.
I saw a
couple
silent movie
times.
of it.
Yeah, silent and
I saw a
no
silent movie of
no
it.
mhm. No
Yeah.
voices.
Yeah. They're all silent movies, right? So there's
Mhm.
no talking. We're going to
Right.
talk about that in a minute.
Mhm.
Oh, no, listen, you don't.
And
And
but
everybody.
there'd be music. I'm
Yes. Mhm.
looking at something here. Let me see.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm jumping in late.
Oh, Monique, you're
Because
okay.
we don't. Because we do not.
Okay, let me
Disrespect
pull
anything.
up this
Because we
this
don't merchandise.
this video. It's actually not okay. I probably shouldn't even bother showing you. But this is an old silent movie. It's actually the actor Buster Keaton. It's not Charlie Chaplin. So this is I thought this was Charlie Chaplin, but it's not Charlie Chaplin. But this is a famous clip. Now I have the sound turned off, but it's just, you know, exciting music. I don't know what this movie's about, but it's a famous thing. Okay, so watch. This is the actor Buster Keaton in the 1920s, and this stunt that he does here is super, super famous. So watch what they do.
Mhm.
And Buster Keaton was very much like Charlie Chaplin.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Okay. Okay. Whatever this windstorm is here, this is a famous shot from this Buster Keaton movie. Let's watch it again. Okay. Now that actor, he could have died, you know.
Yeah.
So today we have our own special effects and stuff. But you
Yeah.
know, in the 1920s, you
Stuntman.
go and
Mhm.
you're going to see something like that and be pretty impressed.
Right.
Let's see. I thought that was Charlie Chaplin, but it wasn't. Let's
Today
see.
we have a stuntman, right? All do
Ruby, I was just thinking the same thing. And yeah, today we have people who will do it for you.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Mhm.
So okay, well you can. There's all kinds of Charlie Chaplin, and he's just, you know, he plays. He's ends up usually being a klutz or a goofball or something. And who knows
Mhm.
what Charlie Chaplin eating machine. Okay. And I mean, it's a comedy. Okay. So this is, and he's got the mustache. That's Charlie Chaplin with the mustache. It's actually like the same mustache that Adolf Hitler had. So it's kind of weird. Um, so this is the kind of stuff. This is in the 1920s. This would be a pretty good movie here. Okay. So Charlie Chaplin's just kind of goofy and crazy sometimes. Okay.
No hand to eat corn in
Yeah.
the cup.
Yeah. I don't know what that's about, but okay. So that's Charlie Chaplin.
Hold on, listen, everyone. This
Eh,
because this is extremely important. Everybody remember this. When I call you downstairs, you have to come downstairs looking gloomy.
I think Jendai is talking to somebody else. So, so it says, okay, in 1927, the world of the silent movie began to wane, to disappear, to go away, with the New
Mhm.
York release of the first talkie. What do you think? Okay, we've not heard this term before, the first talkie. Let's use context clues. What do you think a talkie is?
It was a talking picture.
Yeah, a movie with speech, right?
Mhm.
Um, Okay, so the first talkie in 1927 was The Jazz Singer. The plot of this film, which starred Al Jolson, told a distinctively American story of the 1920s. It follows the life of a Jewish man from his boyhood days of being groomed to be a cantor at the local synagogue to his life as a famous and Americanized jazz singer. Both the story and the new sound technology used to present it were popular with audiences around the country. It quickly became a huge hit. So 1927, you have the first talking movie. Okay. A movie just like we'd see today where there's somebody on the screen, they're talking and you can hear their voice, right?
Mhm.
Which is a big, which is a, you know, I don't know all the technology involved, but that's a big technological jump. It was they up until that time they had a tough time matching the the visual with the audio. They couldn't get them
I was just gonna
synced
say
together.
they had to film separately.
Yeah,
You had to
yeah,
talk your part, and then you had to act your part, and they had to dub them together.
and so it was really hard to do that. Something about, you know, whatever. They didn't have the technology, but then somebody created something. Technology advances. They create a camera that records audio on the same piece of film, same film strip. So it's the same thing. The video and the audio is together. Um, and you know, we take that for granted today. I mean, of course you can hear what the person's saying, right? But back then, that would have been pretty new. The Jazz Singer in 1927. Um, Rona, could you read? What did I read? 4. Rona, can you read paragraph 5?
Yes. Southern California in the 1920s, however, had only recently become the center of the American film industry. Film production was originally based in and around New York, where Thomas Edison first debuted
Debuted.
they debuted the kinescope,
I think kinetoscope. Yeah.
kinetoscope in 1893, but in the 1910s, as major filmmakers like D.W. Griffin looked to escape the cost of Edison patients on camera equipment, this began to change when Griffin filmed in Old California, the first movie ever shot in Hollywood. California in 1910, the small town north of Los Angeles, was little more than a village. As movie makers flocked to Southern California, not least because of its favorable cinema
Climate.
and predictable sunshine. Hollywood swelled with movie making activities. By the 1920s, the once sleepy village was home to a profitable and innovative U.S. industry.
Okay, so today we take for granted that Hollywood, movies are made in Hollywood. Now, a lot of movies are made in Hollywood. I think Hollywood's not quite as, Hollywood, the place, is not as important today as it once was. But, you know, we all know what Hollywood means, right? The making of movies. We think of Hollywood as like the whole movie industry. Well, Hollywood is a town. It's a town in California, Hollywood, California. And so you might think historically, you might say, well, why Hollywood for making movies? And this paragraph gives us a little bit of information. You know, D.W. Griffith looked to escape the cost of Edison's patents, right? His patents, the rights he had on camera equipment. And so perhaps at random, you know, he makes a movie called In Old California. To make that movie, he has to go to California. He maybe picks the town Hollywood, California. And maybe just because of that, that becomes the hub, the center of the movie making industry. Now it says it has a favorable climate, predictable sunshine. If you're shooting a movie, you want nice weather, right? Because you know you want predictable. You want it to be sunny. You want it to be nice, and you know can't have. If you're shooting a sunny day in your movie, and it's a cloudy day, you have to wait till tomorrow. So you know that climate, that weather makes it a nice place to make movies. And so just kind of perhaps at random, this Hollywood, California is just kind of becomes its own monster in the movie making industry. So it says by the 1920s, the once sleepy village was home to a profitable and innovative U.S. industry. Didn't have to be in Hollywood, California. I mean, maybe they could have started making movies in St. Louis or Cleveland, Ohio or something, but it just happened to be Hollywood, California. So that's why we, you know, today we talk, when you're talking about movie lovers or whatever, you talk about Hollywood, right? So that's kind of, you know, I think that's interesting to look at history. Why there? Well, sometimes there's not great reasons. There's some reasons, but there's lots of other places with nice weather. So, you know, just kind of sometimes things are just happen. So movie making, you know, you have Charlie Chaplin. We looked at Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton was a very famous movie maker. Those guys made a lot of silent movies. You have the 1927 The Jazz Singer, and then from there it takes off. Okay, so movies, and now nobody's watching movies at home, right? They're only available in the theaters. The theaters are very affordable for regular people, and very popular. So let's jump into the power of radio in the world of sports. After being introduced during World War I, radios became a common feature in American homes in the 1920s. Hundreds of radio stations popped up over the course of the decade. These stations developed and broadcasted news, serial stories, and political speeches. Okay, so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, was the president after this time, but he was the president during much of he was the one who was elected to 4 terms, FDR. And he served during most of the Great Depression and then through World War II.
Mhm.
And he was famous for making these, what he called fireside chats. And it was a radio show. Okay. So just like today, President Trump used Twitter, right? Before that, Obama was on Twitter. Obama was gave a lot of speeches, gave a lot of interviews, like on even late night TV. The president, even with FDR and the radio, the president of the United States wants to reach the American people. So you see, you could draw a historical line, and people write books about the idea, drawing a line from FDR talking on the radio, Roosevelt giving his weekly fireside chats over the radio, broadcast to the whole nation. You could draw a line from there to Donald Trump tweeting all the time, reaching the American people.
There's an interesting fact in between that too. Like when after FDR, moving into the Nixon and JFK era, they used marketing ads. So like back in the day, you would see like marketing ads for cigarettes and coffee and stuff like that. They use those marketing ads like we see on commercials on TV. And then you draw the line down to like Twitter. Like it really is interesting when you look at it in a 6 degree of separation.
Yeah. So now you can see, it's different, but you can see the similarities. It's fun to make those comparisons.
It is.
Mhm.
So, and it was pretty, I have no idea the technology involved, but it's pretty easy and cheap to run a radio station. So, and of course, anybody with a radio can tune to their dial to that frequency. And if they're close enough, if the broadcast is powerful enough, they're close enough to the station, they can hear it, right? So it says hundreds of radio stations popped up across the country over the course of the decade. Some were big. NBC, the TV station NBC started as a radio station. The National Broadcasting Corporation. And then you had schools would have a radio station. Car dealerships, selling Model Ts. Car dealerships would sometimes have their own radio station. Because if you're a car dealership, you want to advertise your cars. So you make it doesn't have to be 24 hours a day. You make a couple of evening radio shows that are interesting for people to tune into. And in between the radio shows, you advertise your own cars, right? So it's a cheap way to do it. So people, again, schools, grocery stores had their own radio stations. Like it was a thing. It'd be kind of neat. Serial stories. Serial means this word cereal doesn't mean the cereal we eat for breakfast, but like a story that's in a series. So just like today, we have television shows or Netflix shows that are a series, right? It's I'm thinking of picture a show that's fiction, right? And it's every show builds on the next. It's telling a long story over a series of TV shows, right? They had the same kind of thing for radio.
Yeah.
Superman was a radio show. If you've ever heard of Dick Tracy was a radio show. So there's no television. Like there is zero television at this time. It does not exist. So people would tune in every week, every Thursday at 8 p.m. and find out what Superman is doing that week. Little Orphan Annie was a radio show. And some were drama, some were comedy, right? Some were for kids, some were for adults. But just like we have television and Netflix shows today, there was radio shows. Today, not so much. When you tune into the radio, it's mostly music, right? And if you do listen to talk radio, it's news. So much news, nonfiction. There's a lot of great radio shows, but very, very seldom, almost never. I can't think of any place on the radio that I can tune to, like tune in my car to a radio to hear a fictional story, right? We don't do that. We don't do that anymore. We've moved on. Our fictional stories, we put them elsewhere on television, on Netflix, on YouTube, or a podcast sometimes. But things are moving away. In the 1920s, again, just like in this picture, you would gather around and sit and listen, just like we would a few decades later. Everybody would gather around and look at their television. They'd gather around and look at their radio, or listen to their radio. So there was news, serial stories, and political speeches. Much like in print media, advertising space was interspersed with entertainment. Yet, unlike with magazines and newspapers, advertisers did not have to depend on the active participation of consumers. Advertisers could reach out to anyone within listening distance of the radio. On the other hand, a broader audience meant advertisers had to be more conservative and careful not to offend anyone. So today we have very targeted ads, right? Like depending on the things you click on Facebook or on Google or something, you're going to see certain ads. Right? Back then, there's no such thing. So the companies who are broadcasting over the radio, you may advertise for, maybe there's a sale on Model T Fords, but not quite everybody wants to buy a Model T. So you're not actually talking to everybody. So it's, it says the advertisers have to be a little more careful in what they say, how they reach out. The history of advertising is kind of interesting. Monique, could you read paragraph 8?
The power of radio further accelerated the process of creating a shared national culture that had started when railroads and telegraphs funded the distribution of the newspapers. Radio was far more effective than these print media. However, radio created and pumped out American culture onto the airwaves and into the homes of families around the country.
That's interesting. So accelerated the process of creating a shared national culture. There were, I guess before that, you probably have regional cultures like the South and the West and the Midwest and New England. But a lot of these very popular radio shows would be broadcast on many different radio stations across the whole country. So like Superman really was a popular radio show. So across the country, people are listening to Superman. And perhaps a bigger advertiser, maybe not like one car dealership, but maybe all of Ford would put its ad for the Model T or whatever Ford car on the whole country when they're listening to Superman that evening. So, or the president's speech. Roosevelt's fireside chats in the 1930s and 40s were broadcast to the whole country. So it's kind of interesting to think we have, for the first time in American history and world history, can so many people be listening to the same thing simultaneously? Up until then, if you wanted to hear the president's speech, you'd probably have to wait until it was printed in your local newspaper. And then you just read it. But maybe that's a week after it was made, the speech was made. So now we've got, like it says, it accelerated the process of creating a shared national culture that had started when railroads and telegraphs widened the distribution of newspapers. So now we have, for the first time, the whole country can participate, listen to the same thing at the same time. You know, that's certainly, now we have Twitter where everybody can be told the same thing at the same time instantaneously. If YouTube, or if you hear about something on the news or some entertainment, somebody tells you something funny happened, you can get on. Now it's of course on your phone, which is crazy. You know, we take it for granted that we have a shared national culture, but that's only about 100 years old, you know. Jendai, could you read paragraph 9?
Syndicated radio programs like Amos and Andy, which, which began in the late 1920s and entertained listeners around the country. In the case of the popular Amos and Andy, it did so with negative racial stereotypes about African Americans similar to those portrayed in mysterious shows of the previous century. With the radio, Americans from coast to coast could listen to exactly the same programming. This had the effect on smoothing out regional differences in dialect, language, music, and even consumer taste.
Okay, so that's interesting. Makes 2 points. Amos and Andy was a famous radio show. Syndicated means it was broadcast on many different radio stations around the country. And Amos and Andy, if you look it up, you know, I don't know much about it, but I can kind of picture. Well, let's see what we can do here. Let's see. Well, okay, so Amos and, well, okay, so here we go. Here's Amos and Andy in blackface, right? Which is when white people paint their faces and act like black people, which is always used as with racial stereotypes. So, and you'd wonder, well, like, this is a radio show, like there's nothing visual about it, but I guess, you know, somehow it was portrayed across the internet. So Amos and Andy had racially bad things that we wouldn't, of course, put up with today, but it was popular. I don't think it was all racial, but certainly they had episodes or whatever that were racial. So there's that. Okay, just because we're not talking about racism in these couple of readings doesn't mean it's not existing in 1920s life. Still plenty of racism going on in America. But it says, it makes the interesting point. You know, I just talked about the beginning of a national culture, and national culture is good, right? I think it's cool to be able to share experiences with, here's the cat, with somebody in New York and California, right? That's kind of neat. But it says it had the effect of smoothing out regional differences in dialect, language, music, and even consumer taste. So if you're listening to a radio station in Mobile, Alabama, you're going to hear people who sound like you, right, with a Southern accent. Or if you're in Chicago, you're going to hear people who speak in a Chicago accent. If you're suddenly listening to Amos and Andy, which is made in New York, but, I'm guessing, I don't know, made in New York, but is broadcast over the whole country. Here comes the cat again. You're not listening to local voices. You're not listening to local, or if it's national news, you're not listening to local concerns. Now it's national concerns, national news, which has its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. It smooths out regional differences in dialect, language. So maybe over time, I mean, if you talk today, and there's people who do studies about this, but like accents today, regional accents, the Southern accent, the New England accent, the New York accent, right? We've all heard accents. Not talking like speakers of other languages, but like regional American accents. They're disappearing because we're all watching YouTube, we're all watching and listening to the same TV and for 100 years radio, right? And so you're not listening to somebody one town over who talks just like you. You're listening to somebody from New York, from wherever, and those regional differences start to disappear, which can be a bad thing, I think. Okay. Let me read paragraph 10. Radio also transformed how Americans enjoyed sports. Okay, so we've talked about radio. Now we're going to see how sports has existed for a long time, right? But how does radio change the way we interact with sports? The introduction of play-by-play descriptions of sporting events broadcast over the radio brought sports entertainment right into the homes of millions. Okay. That's an invention, play-by-play sports, right? If you've ever listened to sports on the radio, has anybody ever listened to, say, a football game or anything on the radio? Not on TV, but on the radio. Has anybody ever done that?
Yeah, once a while, when the game is on, when we want to go somewhere, my husband does put on, and I say, I don't want to hear this.
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't care, yeah, if you don't like it, it's
I want music.
yeah.
I
But
like
to your
baseball. I don't like listening to football on the radio.
right, if it's not your thing, then so be
Yeah.
it. But for Ruby, for your husband, I'm sure he's sitting there picturing the players, picturing when they say somebody hits a home run, he can see it in his mind, right?
Right.
That's a 1920s invention.
Mhm.
Up until that, there was no such thing, right? There was no radio. People weren't listening to the radio. Now that we have radio in the 1920s, you can have those football plays, the baseball play-by-play, and people are listening. You can listen to a baseball game that you're not at
Mhm.
live as it happens, and that's that'd be a new pretty cool thing. Okay. Then of course advertisers are going to put in there. That's then going to change the pace of football and baseball the way they're played, right? Now all of a sudden they say, hey, let's make this timeout last a little bit longer. The radio broadcast that's paying for our football team is running a commercial, so we can't start play yet, right? So that's going to change things. Advertising, that football team needs to make money, so they sell they sell advertising on the radio play-by-play, and so the game has to be played slower. Now a football game takes 3 hours. If you ever watched a football game or listened to it, it's a 1 hour game, but it takes 3 hours because there's so many breaks. Those
Yeah.
breaks didn't used to exist quite so much
Mhm.
until we started running commercials and radio ads in between all the plays. Okay, so it says radio helped to popularize sports figures and their accomplishments. So not just listening to sports, but now, you hear Babe Ruth. We're going to see Babe Ruth in a minute. Individuals, you can start to get excited about individual players. It says Jim Thorpe, here pictured to the right. Jim Thorpe, who grew up in the Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma, he's a Native American, was known as one of the best athletes in the world. He medaled in the 1912 Olympic Games, played Major League Baseball, and was one of the founding members of the National Football League. Okay, so Jim Thorpe, people write books about him. We have in Pennsylvania, there's the town, Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. I think that's where he went to high school, where he kind of grew up a little bit. Although he grew up as a child in Oklahoma, as a teenager, I think he grew up in Pennsylvania. They took him away from his family as a Native American young person, and he was forcibly adopted into a white family and sent to a school for Native American boys, trying to basically not turn them white physically, but turn them white culturally. There was a time when the government would kidnap. I mean, how is it not kidnapping? They would take Native American kids from their homes out west, wherever they're from their Native American parents and forcibly adopt them into white families. He was one of them. Kind of was one of the best athletes America's ever seen. He medaled in the 1912 Olympics, played Major League Baseball and in the NFL, the very early NFL. And he was very popular. You would know about him because you've heard him on the radio, and you've maybe seen clips of his Olympics or baseball or football at the movie theater when they run newsreels, when they run news clips. Okay, Ruby, can you read paragraph 12?
Okay, I'm going to try.
Okay.
Other sports superstars were soon household names as well. In 1926, graduate Elder became the first woman to swim the English Channel. Ellen Well
Dominated
women's tennis, winning Wimbledon 8 times in the late 1920s. Bill Tilden won the national singles title every year from 1920s to 1925. In football, Arnold Grange played for the University of Illinois, averaging over 10 yards per carry during his college career. The biggest star of all was the Sultan of Swat.
His nickname was the Sultan of Swat. A sultan is like a king, and Swat, I guess, is just swinging the bat.
Sultan of Swat. Babe Ruth, who became America's first football hero.
Okay, so Babe Ruth in 1927 with the New York Yankees. Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and a couple other big names. That was the first year. I think 1927 was Babe Ruth's, for a long time, the most, his record for home runs, I think, was 1927. He single-handedly hit more home runs in 1927 than most other teams did that year. So Babe Ruth was a heck of a baseball player. And, these other names, somebody swims the English Channel. We got tennis. Helen Wills, a couple of women here. Helen Wills wins Wimbledon 8 times. Big Bill Tilden, this is also tennis. Harold Red Grange plays football. And then Babe Ruth is the biggest star.
Happy guy, huh?
Yeah. So, and before radio, you'd hear about them in the paper, but I mean, radio really makes it popular for these people to get, or makes it possible for them to get popular nationally. Even if you don't live in New York, you're going to know who Babe Ruth is on the New York Yankees. And, like it said at the beginning, people had more, the influx of cash coupled with advancements in technology led to new patterns of leisure and consumption. So people had more free money because the economy is going well, jobs were good. And some, people always have some degree of free time. So really, movies, radio, and sports in the 1920s were a big thing. Okay, so I think it's neat to see those similarities. Obviously, it's easy to see the differences, but it's very easy in the 1920s, 100 years ago, to really start to recognize ourselves in the America of the 1920s. What do you guys think?
It's kind of neat. It's good to know.
Yeah. Anything else from, I'm sure, I'm sure there's all kinds of great information out there about all these things that are starting back then that we would recognize today. But we've talked about movies and radio. They kind of combine really to become television, really. Sports is very popular. Advertising. Today, you are going to see hundreds of ads, right? Either online, on your phone, on the television, hear it on the radio, see it in a magazine. Advertising's huge. Airplanes, cars, right? Your day is going to be affected by them. So it's really, the modern world really does start to appear in the 1920s, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in ads now, they like forced on you. Like you have your cell phone,
Hmm.
you can't get away from them. They sending you ads through your email, through your phone.
Right. Yeah,
Like,
they're
you
sneaky
can't,
too sometimes.
calling you on the phone, like
Uh-huh.
you just can't get away from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, and so, the roots of that start in commercial radio. We take it for granted if you watch television every 5 or 7 minutes or something, there's a commercial break, right?
Mhm.
Well, back then they had their commercial breaks too. And you're listening to the Superman radio show every week or every night. Uh, they're going to stop and play some ads.
Mhm.
And if it's a small radio station, it's going to be local ads for your grocery store, your car dealership. But if it's a nationally syndicated, it's going to be bigger companies, national companies, and they're going to pay more money to reach more people. Um, Advertising is a big part of the world. I was going to say America, but really it's the whole world because
Mhm.
people want to make money and want to sell stuff, and so
Yeah.
that's the way things are. But you see the roots of it in commercial radio. So, well, something to think about. I think it's fun to look around and see the history and in the things around us.
Yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
to see back then how it started.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And some of this is very much on purpose, right? Henry Ford and the other people inventing cars back then was very much on purpose. They wanted to make a good car. They wanted to make Charles Lindbergh very much wanted to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Other things are a little more accidental, right? Why are movies made in Hollywood, California? Well, because one movie was made and then everybody followed. Um, some things are just kind of random, a little bit random.
Yeah,
Some things are
and
very
that's
on purpose.
like California, Hollywood, California is still talked about more today, like going there and acting and
Yeah. Yeah.
becoming stars. I feel like any other place, California is talked about more.
Yeah.
As far as when I think of Hollywood or actors, I think of Hollywood and California.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to see a little bit of that
Yeah.
reason why. So, well, cool. Well, I will send this out. I'll send out the reading and the recording. I'll send it out this
Mhm.
afternoon. Um, yeah, I like looking at a little bit of everyday life. So maybe we'll jump to a different decade next week and just
Okay.
kind of seeing what life was like. I think that's kind of fun.
Mhm.
And of course, and then always keeping in the back of your mind, okay, what else is going on in the 1920s? We've done other readings where we talked about prohibition. This didn't mention prohibition at all, but of course, 1920s, you also have prohibition going on.
Right.
So, the more you learn about history, the more you have to like kind of weave things together to get the full picture.
What was prohibition?
Prohibition was the 18th Amendment,
Mhm.
like the national amendment to the Constitution, prohibits the sale of alcohol. So
Uh,
people still drank alcohol. Alcohol consumption actually went up in the 1920s, but it was illegal. So then you have, these illegal bars, these, you'd have to sneak into a place, or, people were making their own alcohol, moonshine, and making wine at home and stuff like that. So, and then of course that enables organized crime. Yeah, I think the prohibition reading we've done a few weeks ago talks about Al Capone, right? And the mafia and these big mobsters, these big organized crime guys, they really gain power and money because of prohibition, because they're making the liquor and selling it. So that, this doesn't mention prohibition. 2 readings of the life in the 1920s, and I don't think it mentioned alcohol once, but it's also going on, So, all right. Well, thanks for logging in, everybody. I like this kind of stuff. It's fun to look at.
Thanks,
So,
Matt.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
It makes so much. It makes
Bye-bye.
so much sense.
yeah, it does help you make sense of kind of knowing the history of something today.
Right. Mhm.
So, all right, cool. Well, everybody, have a great day. Enjoy May. We're into May, so have a great weekend.
Have a great
You
weekend.
too.
guys.
Now,
Bye-bye.
did you hear? Did you hear the news? Did you hear? I want you
What's
to
that?
know. I don't know if you got vaccinated or not, but Mr. Governor Tom Wolf, he said he's going to lift up all the restrictions on the 31st of May.
Yeah, I did hear that, like the social distancing and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well,
except for wearing masks.
right. Yeah, I guess like
Yeah,
maybe
masks.
not social distancing, but like limits on restaurants and stuff. Yeah, I did hear that. Yeah.
He said mask man. He
Mhm.
said mask is going to be lifted when 70% gets vaccinated.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So